Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into the story of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. I know a lot of you are fascinated by this guy, and honestly, so am I. He was a key player in World War II, but there's a lot more to him than just tanks and desert warfare.
Oh, absolutely. Rommel is one of those figures who just captures the imagination. Brilliant military mind, but operating within the Nazi regime, so you have to grapple with that too.
Right, exactly. So we're going to try to untangle all of that. We've got a ton of sources, historical accounts, personal letters, the works. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, shall we? Rommel was born in Germany in 1891. His father was a teacher, but it seems like young Erwin had other ideas.
Yeah, the classroom wasn't really his scene. At 18, he enlisted in the military, joined the 124th Württemberg Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet.
This was 1910, right? So just a few years before the whole world changes with World War I.
And World War I really is where Rommel makes his mark. He earns the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration for his actions on the Italian front.
Now, this wasn't just some random act of bravery, was it? He was already showing signs of, well, I guess you could call it genius, even then.
Definitely. This is where he starts developing those infiltration tactics that would later make him so famous, bypassing strong points, focusing on speed and disruption, really shaking things up.
Sounds kind of like a preview of those blitzkrieg strategies we associate him with, right?
Exactly. He takes those early experiences and formalizes them in his book, Infantry Attacks. This was published between the wars.
Okay, so this book wasn't just some dusty military manual, though. It was actually pretty radical, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, totally ahead of its time. Rommel argued for smaller, more mobile units, coordinated attacks, exploiting weaknesses in the enemy lines. Totally different from the static trench warfare that had defined World War I.
In this book, it actually becomes required reading for the German military, so he's really shaping the thinking of a whole generation of soldiers.
He's basically laying the groundwork for his own future successes, too.
So let's fast forward to World War II. By 1940, Rommel is leading the 7th Panzer Division during the invasion of France.
And this is where his mastery of armored warfare really comes into play. Speed, aggression, using tanks not just as support, but as the main attacking force. Classic blitzkrieg.
And that success in France is what propels him to North Africa in 1941, right?
Yep. The Italians were struggling against the British, and the stakes were huge. Control of the Suez Canal, access to Middle Eastern oil, it was a vital theater of the war.
And that's where he earns the nickname Desert Fox, right? I mean, it's not just that he's winning battles, it's how he's doing it, this almost mythical cunning.
Right. He's outmaneuvering the British at every turn, using the desert terrain to his advantage, making sure his forces are supplied and mobile.
He's also leading from the front, inspiring his troops. There are all these stories about him personally rallying units, leading counterattacks, even sharing the same rations as his men.
That's a key part of his leadership style. He was demanding, no doubt, but he also earned the respect of his soldiers by sharing their risks. They saw him as someone who was fighting alongside them, not just sending them into battle.
But this kind of daring, always pushing the limits, always gambling, did that eventually contribute to his downfall in North Africa?
Well, there's definitely an argument to be made there. Rommel was always willing to take risks that others wouldn't. Sometimes it paid off brilliantly, other times...
Like at El Alamein?
Yeah, like El Alamein. He commanded a huge force there, but ultimately couldn't overcome the combined Allied strength. And those logistical challenges of fighting in the desert, those really started to catch up with him too. You need constant supplies, fuel, reinforcements.
And by 1943, it's over. His time in North Africa comes to an end.
But his reputation, both for brilliance and for controversy, is solidified.
And it's those controversies, along with those lessons he learned in the desert, that are going to shape what happens next. But that's a story for part 2. We'll pick it up there.
So we're in 1943 now. Things aren't looking so good for Germany. And Rommel, he gets sent to France. Big job. Got to fortify the Atlantic Wall. Allies are coming.
Yeah, a huge shift, right? From wide open desert warfare to, hunkering down on the coast? How'd that change his thinking?
Well, he'd seen firsthand what Allied air power could do in North Africa. Knew those static defenses, they weren't going to cut it. Had to come up with something new.
So instead of those big bunkers further inland, like the usual defense in depth idea.
Right. He's like, nope, we stop them right there on the beaches. Famous quote, actually. The war will be won or lost on the beaches. That was Rommel.
But wouldn't that make his troops like sitting ducks out in the open?
It was a risk, for sure. But his whole thing was a strong, fast counterattack right away. Stop the Allies from getting a foothold. Millions of mines, underwater obstacles, even wanted to flood some areas.
Sounds almost desperate, you know?
Well, remember, there was a lot of political wrangling going on too. Some of the German high command, guys like Field Marshal Rundstedt, they weren't buying it. Thought Rommel was overreacting. Thought the real fight would be inland.
So you've got these clashing personalities, different strategies.
Exactly. And it shows something about Rommel, Always a bit of a maverick, didn't always play by the rules, thought his experience in Africa, it gave him special insight.
And this time, his opponent, it's going to be his old rival, Montgomery.
Yeah, almost like a rematch, right? Two of the best military minds going head-to-head. Rommel even predicted where the Allies would land. Focused defenses around Normandy.
And, well, we know how that turns out. D-Day, June 6th, 1944, beginning of the end for the Nazis.
It's a tough chapter. Rommel wasn't even there on D-Day, back in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday.
Huh.
Then, just a month later, there's that attempt on Hitler's life, the July 20th plot.
And Rommel, the war hero, gets caught up in that.
It's still debated how involved he really was. Some say he was just vaguely aware of it. Others think he played a bigger part. Either way, the Nazis saw him as a problem, gave him a terrible choice. Suicide, or a show trial, execution. His family would have been in danger too.
So October 14th, 1944, Rommel takes his own life, forced into that impossible corner.
And of course, the Nazis spun it. Said he died from wounds in an Allied air attack. But the truth eventually came out. Just another layer of complexity to this guy's story.
It's almost like something out of Shakespeare. This brilliant but flawed leader rises so high, but the system he was part of, it brings him down in the end.
Yeah, makes you wonder, what if he'd used his talents differently, for a different cause?
That's something to think about as we go into the last part of our deep dive. We'll be trying to sort out Rommel's legacy, the good, the bad, everything. Okay, so we've gone from Rommel's early years, all the way through those North African campaigns, that whole Atlantic Wall situation, and then that, well, really tragic ending. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, and it's interesting how even now, all these years later, people are still talking about Rommel.
Yeah.
Debating his actions, his choices. I mean, he was undoubtedly a military genius, a really captivating leader, but then there's that whole Nazi thing, right? It's complicated.
It really is. And I think that's what makes his legacy so hard to figure out. On the one hand, you've got these amazing military accomplishments. Like, they still study his tactics at West Point and all those places.
Oh, absolutely. Rommel's impact on the battlefield, that's undeniable.
Yeah.
His focus on speed and mobility and decisive action, I mean, that changed the way wars were fought.
Yeah.
And the way he connected with his troops, too, that's something else. They saw him as a real leader, someone who was right there in the thick of it with them.
Yeah, and that brings us to that question that always comes up. How much can you separate the man from the system he was a part of? Can you really judge Rommel without considering the whole Nazi context?
It's a tough one. There is evidence that he wasn't like a diehard Nazi ideologue. At first, he might have been drawn to the idea of, restoring Germany's strength.
Right, and I've read that as the war went on and the true nature of the Nazi regime became clearer, he started to have doubts, right? Some people even say that him being connected to that July 20th plot to kill Hitler, that shows how disillusioned he'd become.
Yeah, there's definitely evidence pointing in that direction. But even if we acknowledge those later doubts, he still supported the regime early on. He participated in a war of aggression. You can't just ignore those things.
So it's complicated, it's nuanced, and it makes you think about how we judge historical figures in general. Do we look at them through the lens of their own time? Or do we hold them to the day's standards?
It's a question that comes up all the time with historical figures, especially ones who lived through those really turbulent times. Tough to say what the right answer is.
So where does all of this leave us with Rommel? What are the big takeaways, the lessons we can learn from this guy's life?
Well, one thing's for sure. Context matters. You can't understand Rommel without understanding the world he lived in, all the political and social stuff that influenced his choices.
It's like a reminder that history isn't just dates and battles. It's real people making real decisions, often in really tough situations.
Exactly. And I think another big takeaway is be careful about hero worship. Rommel's been romanticized a lot over the years, right? The noble knight fighting a clean war. But there's no such thing as a clean war. And even the best leaders make mistakes.
Yeah, it's a reminder that things aren't always black and white. History, just like life, is messy and full of contradictions.
And those contradictions, that's where the real learning happens. I mean, Rommel's story, even with all the darkness and tragedy, it teaches us about leadership, about the tough choices people have to make, and how those choices, they can really shape history.
So that's our deep dive into the life of Erwin Rommel. And we'll leave you with this. What do you think? How does Rommel's story change the way you view war, leadership, the whole idea of good versus evil? Keep thinking about it, keep learning. History is full of these fascinating, complicated figures, and the more we understand them, the more we understand ourselves.